In 1891, justice did not always arrive with truth. Sometimes it arrived with silence. This is the story of a boy named John, too young to understand the weight of accusation, too quiet to defend himself in a world that never planned to listen. They said he belonged behind iron bars. They said his future was already decided. But inside those walls, something began to happen. Something no verdict could explain, and no punishment could erase. Before we begin, subscribe to the Black Timeline. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the story history tried to forget. And stay with us until the end when this chapter closes. Leave a comment and tell us how deeply it moved you. John was born into a year that already expected too much from him and promised too little in return, a time when the world measured boys like him not by their laughter or curiosity, but by how quickly they could be blamed. In the late 1870s, his earliest memories formed around ordinary things: dust drifting through open windows, the scrape of shoes along wooden floors, the way voices changed when authority entered a room. But even as a child, he sensed that sound carried meaning beyond words. He learned to listen because listening was safer than speaking, because silence could pass unnoticed while questions invited trouble. His mother, worn thin by work and worry, used to say that quiet could be a kind of armor, and John believed her, not because it made him invisible, but because it helped him understand how people moved when they thought no one was paying attention. He noticed how adults stiffened before giving orders, how they softened when they wanted agreement, how they grew loud when they were uncertain. And these observations settled into him as naturally as breathing. He did not know they would one day be called a gift. To him, they were simply the way the world made sense. When the accusation came, it arrived without warning and without explanation, as so many did in the era, born not of evidence but of convenience, because something had gone missing and someone had to carry the weight of it, and John happened to be close enough, quiet enough, small enough to fit the shape of blame. He did not understand the urgency in the adults' movements or the tightness in their voices, only that the air around him had changed, that attention had turned sharp and fixed, and that his usual silence, once unremarkable, had suddenly become suspicious. They asked questions quickly, stacking them one on top of another, and when he paused to think, when he searched for the right way to explain what he had seen without angering anyone, they mistook his carefulness for evasion. The room felt too large, the faces too many, and each second of quiet stretched until it felt like proof of something he did not know how to refute. He tried to speak, but words came slowly, shaped by a habit of caution, and in that slowness the decision seemed to form without him, as though the outcome had been waiting for the moment his voice faltered. The courtroom, if it deserved the name, moved with a speed that did not belong to truth but to certainty, the certainty of a system accustomed to deciding first and justifying later. John stood beneath the weight of language not meant for children, terms that sounded final even when he could not grasp their meaning, and the adults spoke as though his presence were incidental, as though the story had already been written, and he was merely a footnote to be placed where it fit best. When the sentence was delivered, it did not feel like punishment for an act he had committed. It felt like removal, like being lifted out of his own life and set down somewhere unfamiliar, because the machinery of judgment required a body to carry its conclusion. There were no tears in that moment, not because he did not feel fear, but because fear had gone quiet, settling deep and steady, the way it does when the mind is overwhelmed. The walk from the room felt longer than it should have, each step echoing with a finality he did not yet understand, and the door that closed behind him sounded less like an end than like a ceiling, as though something essential had been shut away where it could no longer be reached. Prison was not built with boys in mind, and the first days passed in fragments, hard edges, cold surfaces, the unyielding repetition of routine until time itself seemed to lose shape. John learned quickly that attention could be dangerous, and that questions, however innocent, invited consequences, so he returned to the habit that had always served him. He watched. He watched how guards walked the corridors, how their steps changed when they were irritated or distracted, how their voices carried different weights depending on who was listening. He watched the other inmates too, the way shoulders tensed before tempers flared, the subtle signals that preceded violence or withdrawal. And at night, when the noise settled into an uneasy hush, he listened to the building itself, the creak of metal, the distant murmur of voices, the rhythm of a place that never truly slept. Listening did not make him safe, but it made him oriented, and orientation was something he could hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. He followed rules precisely, not out of submission, but out of calculation, because precision reduced unpredictability, and unpredictability was the true danger. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and in that time his listening deepened into pattern recognition. though he would not have used those words. He simply noticed that certain tensions preceded certain outcomes, that routines shifted before announcements were made, that silence often meant more than speech, and when he spoke rarely, carefully it was to name what seemed obvious to him, not realizing how strange it sounded to others. The first time a guard dismissed his quiet observation as coincidence, John accepted the dismissal without protest, because protest would have required explanation, and explanation would have invited scrutiny he did not want. When the observation proved correct, he did not feel vindicated. He felt confirmed in what he already knew, that paying attention mattered even when no one acknowledged it. As these moments accumulated, a subtle awareness began to form around him, not admiration but curiosity, the uneasy kind that arises when something does not fit the expected order. John did not seek this attention. He learned to minimize it, to offer his insight sparingly and without insistence, because insistence threatened the fragile balance he had achieved. He remained quiet, careful, invisible when possible, yet the place itself seemed to respond to him, as though the act of naming patterns altered the flow of events in ways no one had anticipated. None of this felt like power to John. It felt like survival refined into habit. He did not think of himself as special or gifted. He thought of himself as someone who listened because listening had always been necessary. The system around him, however, began to sense an anomaly it could not easily categorize, and anomalies unsettled institutions built on predictability. For now, though, the machinery of judgment moved on, content to let time do what time often did in such places, erode memory, dull edges, and turn a boy into a number whose story would fade into routine. John did not know this then. He only knew the cadence of days and nights, the weight of iron and rules, and the quiet certainty that if he stopped paying attention, something worse than punishment might happen. And so he continued to listen, continued to watch, carrying his innocence not as a shield but as a steady core, unaware that this steadiness, this refusal to surrender awareness, would become the very thing no one could explain, the beginning of a story the system had not planned to tell and could not easily erase. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both relentless and strangely hollow, as though time inside the prison had been stripped of its ordinary meaning and replaced with repetition for its own sake. John learned quickly that survival depended on understanding this rhythm, not resisting it, not questioning it, but learning where it bent and where it broke. Morning arrived not with light, but with sound, metal striking metal, voices calling numbers instead of names, boots moving with practiced indifference. He rose when told, stood where indicated, moved when motion was demanded, and through it all he remained quiet, not because silence was demanded, but because silence gave him room to observe without being noticed. Each action, each pause, each glance carried information, and John absorbed it the way he always had, without urgency, without judgment, simply letting it arrange itself inside him. The other inmates learned to categorize one another quickly, sorting people into threats, allies, or background noise. John fell easily into the last category. He was too young to be considered dangerous, too quiet to be entertaining, too withdrawn to invite confrontation. This anonymity protected him in ways no rule ever could. It allowed him to move through the days without drawing the attention that so often led to punishment or worse. Yet anonymity also sharpened his awareness, because when no one was watching him closely, he could watch everything else. He noticed how certain men avoided specific corners of the yard, how others gravitated toward shadows when tension rose, how the volume of conversation shifted minutes before conflict erupted. None of this required explanation. It simply registered, forming patterns that felt as natural as breathing. Guards, too, followed patterns, though they believed themselves unpredictable. John learned the difference between footsteps that meant routine and those that meant trouble. He learned which voices carried irritation and which carried fatigue, which silences meant oversight had lapsed, and which meant scrutiny had intensified. These distinctions mattered, and he stored them carefully, not as facts to be shared, but as knowledge to be used when necessary. He did not test this knowledge deliberately. Testing invited risk. Instead, he waited for moments when speaking felt less dangerous than remaining silent, when naming something obvious might prevent something worse. The first time he spoke up, it was almost accidental. A door had been left unlocked in a corridor that was always secured at that hour, and John noticed the discrepancy immediately. The absence of the usual sound, a heavy click that marked closure, registered like a missing note in a familiar tune. He mentioned it quietly to a guard passing by, not as accusation, but as observation. The guard waved him off, irritation flickering briefly across his face, and John did not insist. Insistence would have transformed observation into challenge. He returned to his place, attentive as ever. When the oversight became apparent later, when confusion rippled through the corridor and the guard, as irritation sharpened into anger, John felt no satisfaction. He felt only confirmation that the world behaved predictably if one listened closely enough. Word of that incident traveled not loudly, but in the way unease often does through glances, half-phrases, pauses in conversation. The boy noticed things. The boy spoke rarely, but when he did, his words seemed to align with outcomes. Some dismissed this as coincidence, because coincidence was easier than curiosity. Others grew wary, because wariness was safer than acknowledgement. John sensed this shift and adjusted accordingly. He spoke even less, choosing silence more deliberately now, aware that attention, once attracted, rarely faded on its own. As weeks passed, his understanding of the place deepened. He learned that routines were not fixed. They flexed under pressure, altered by fatigue, by resentment, by moments of distraction. He learned that authority, though loud, was often reactive rather than intentional, responding to perceived threats rather than anticipating them. This insight did not make him reckless. It made him cautious. He understood that naming patterns could influence events, but it could also provoke hostility. He chose carefully when to let his observations surface and when to keep them contained. The other inmates began to notice him in quieter ways. Some watched him from a distance, curious but unsure how to approach a boy whose presence seemed to change the air around him. Others ignored him entirely, unwilling to engage with something they could not easily categorize. A few, those who had learned to read environments as carefully as John did, sensed a kinship without naming it. They did not speak of it openly. In a place governed by suspicion, subtle recognition carried more weight than overt alliance. John's nights were long, but they were not empty. When the noise of the day receded, he listened more intently than ever, attuned to the building's own language. He learned the rhythm of night patrols, the way light shifted beneath doors, the cadence of distant voices echoing through corridors. He noticed how tension manifested in sound, the way breathing changed, the way footsteps accelerated or slowed. These nights sharpened his perception, refining it into something almost instinctive. He did not think of it as practice. He thought of it as staying oriented in a place designed to disorient. The guards, for their part, grew increasingly aware of the boy without fully understanding why. Some dismissed him as harmless, a quiet child passing time until he grew into someone else. Others felt a vague unease they could not explain, a sense that the boy's presence disrupted the expected order. They did not articulate this unease. Articulation would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have raised questions no one wanted to answer. Instead, they monitored him loosely, their attention drifting but never fully departing. Incidents continued to occur, small things at first, a shift in routine that John noticed before it was announced. A rising tension that he sensed before voices escalated. Each time he spoke, carefully, without insistence, the outcome reinforced the pattern. Each time he remained silent, the outcome confirmed it as well. He began to understand that his observations did not create events, they merely aligned with them. The world moved according to forces that did not require his participation, but his awareness allowed him to navigate those forces more safely. This understanding brought with it a subtle burden. Awareness meant responsibility, even when no one asked for it. John grappled with this quietly, weighing the risk of speaking against the risk of remaining silent. He did not frame this as morality or duty. He framed it as balance. Balance meant choosing the moment that minimized harm, including harm to himself. In a place where harm was ever present, minimizing it felt like the only victory available. As months turned into years, John changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. His body grew, his voice deepened slightly, but the most significant changes occurred within. He learned to trust his perceptions without announcing them, to act on understanding without drawing attention to the act itself. This discretion became his shield. It allowed him to exist within the system without being consumed by it, to maintain a sense of self even as the environment sought to flatten individuality into routine. The system, however, does not tolerate anomalies indefinitely. What began as curiosity hardened into concern. Officials noticed patterns they could not explain, disruptions that coincided with the boy, as quiet interventions. They did not attribute causality directly. Doing so would have required admitting that a child possessed insight they did not. Instead, they spoke of coincidence, of chance, of the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Yet the unease persisted, and unease, when sustained, demands response. That response came not as inquiry, but as scrutiny. Records were reviewed, conversations occurred behind closed doors. The boy's name surfaced in contexts that carried weight, even if no one spoke it aloud in his presence. John sensed this shift before it was visible. He felt it in the way eyes lingered longer, in the way guards adjusted their posture when passing him, in the subtle tightening of oversight. He responded by retreating further into careful silence, reducing his already minimal footprint. He understood that visibility now carried greater risk than it once had. Despite the scrutiny, his observations continued. He could not turn them off any more than he could stop breathing. He simply learned to manage them more tightly, sharing them only when the alternative felt more dangerous. This restraint did not diminish their accuracy. If anything, it sharpened them because each instance of speaking was now preceded by deliberate calculation. He spoke when outcomes mattered, when silence would compound harm rather than avoid it. Those moments began to carry weight beyond immediate consequence. When John, as quiet words prevented escalation, when they corrected oversights that could have led to chaos, the system felt their impact even as it refused to acknowledge the source. This refusal created tension. Tension demanded explanation. Explanation threatened exposure. The system chose avoidance, hoping time would erode the anomaly as it eroded everything else. But time, in this case, did not erode. It refined. John, understanding, matured into something more cohesive, a framework for interpreting not just the prison, but the people within it. He recognized that authority often reacted to fear rather than reason, that control was maintained through repetition rather than truth. He saw how narratives were constructed to justify outcomes already decided, how innocence could be overlooked when it complicated certainty. These insights did not embitter him. They clarified his place within a larger pattern he had not chosen but could now see. The injustice of his sentence lingered as a constant presence, but it no longer defined him entirely. He understood that innocence, once ignored, did not disappear. It persisted quietly, shaping how one responded to the world. He did not cling to the hope of immediate vindication. Hope, he sensed, could be dangerous if it narrowed focus. Instead, he cultivated endurance, allowing time to do what it often did best: expose inconsistencies, magnify contradictions, reveal the limits of certainty. The system continued its routines, confident in its ability to absorb irregularities. It did not yet recognize that something within it had begun to shift, that a boy it had dismissed as insignificant was quietly altering the flow of events through awareness alone. That recognition would come later, precipitated by necessity rather than insight. For now, John remained where he was, listening as he always had, carrying his understanding forward with patience that did not announce itself as resistance. He did not know what the future held, only that the patterns he observed were converging towards something unavoidable. The walls remained, the routines persisted, the verdict stood. Yet beneath all of it, a quiet pressure built, not the pressure of rebellion, but the pressure of truth accumulating without release. And as that pressure grew, the system's confidence thinned, even if it refused to admit it. The boy who had entered as an erasure was becoming something else entirely, not a symbol, not a spectacle, but a presence that could not be explained away. The gift no one could name continued to unfold, not as miracle, but as consequence, and its next expression would demand attention in ways silence could no longer contain. As the pressure beneath the surface continued to build, it began to manifest in ways that even the system could not entirely ignore. What had once been dismissed as coincidence now appeared too frequently, too precisely aligned with moments of potential disruption to be comfortably overlooked. The prison functioned on predictability, on routines, so ingrained that deviation itself became a signal. John's presence, quiet and unassuming, had begun to intersect with those deviations in ways that unsettled the people responsible for maintaining order, not because he caused disorder, but because he seemed to anticipate it, as though he were listening to something others could not hear, or seeing something they refused to notice. The first official acknowledgement of this unease did not take the form of inquiry or compassion. It came as increased observation. Guards lingered longer near John's assigned areas. Supervisors made notes without explaining what they were recording. Conversation stopped when he approached, then resumed once he passed. None of this was overt enough to challenge, yet all of it was deliberate. John noticed the change immediately. He had learned to recognize the difference between casual attention and targeted scrutiny. And this was the latter. The air around him felt tighter now, as though his silence had acquired weight. He responded instinctively by shrinking further into himself, not in fear, but in calculation. Visibility had become risk. He limited his movements to what was required, avoided unnecessary interaction, and spoke even less than before. When he did speak, it was only when the cost of silence outweighed the danger of being noticed. This restraint did not come easily. Awareness, once cultivated, does not turn itself off. Each moment required judgment, each decision weighed against potential consequence. The burden of this awareness settled heavily, though he carried it without complaint. The system, meanwhile, struggled to interpret what it was observing. The idea that a child, particularly a child like John, might possess insight beyond routine expectation did not fit existing categories. The prison's framework for understanding behavior was built around compliance, defiance, and breakdown. John exhibited none of these. He was compliant without being passive, quiet without being withdrawn, observant without appearing engaged. There was no box to place him in, and what could not be categorized became a problem. This problem surfaced most clearly during moments of heightened tension. A disagreement between inmates escalated rapidly one afternoon, the kind of situation that often erupted into violence before intervention could arrive. John noticed the shift long before voices rose. He heard it in the way footsteps quickened, in the sharpness of breath, in the subtle repositioning of bodies that signaled readiness rather than restlessness. He did not rush forward. He did not shout. He spoke quietly to the nearest guard, naming the tension without dramatizing it. The guard hesitated, then dismissed him with a wave, irritation flaring briefly. John retreated, aware that insistence would only provoke resistance. Minutes later, the conflict erupted exactly as he had anticipated. The response was swift but reactive, the kind that contained damage rather than prevented it. In the aftermath, the guard's earlier dismissal lingered uncomfortably. Nothing was said aloud, but the glance exchanged between guards carried recognition. This was no longer easily dismissed as coincidence. The alignment between John's observations and unfolding events had become too consistent. From that point on, his words rare, as they began to carry an unspoken gravity. Guards did not openly seek his input. Doing so would have inverted the hierarchy they relied upon. Instead, they listened when he spoke, even if they pretended not to. They adjusted patrols subtly, repositioned themselves without explanation, delayed actions that might escalate tension. These adjustments were never attributed to John. Attribution would have required acknowledgement. Instead, the system adapted quietly, absorbing his influence while denying its source. This denial created a peculiar dynamic. John's presence began to shape outcomes without being recognized as cause. He watched this process unfold with detached attention, understanding intuitively that recognition would change everything and not for the better. Recognition would invite questions, scrutiny, and attempts at control. An unnamed influence, however, could persist longer, operating beneath the surface where it was less likely to be challenged directly. The inmates sensed this shift as well, though they lacked the language to describe it. Some began to watch John more closely, not with hostility, but with curiosity tempered by caution. Others avoided him entirely, unwilling to be associated with someone who seemed to alter the flow of events. A few, those who had survived long enough to recognize patterns of power, understood that John occupied a dangerous space, not because he threatened authority openly, but because he complicated it. John felt this awareness pressing in from all sides. He understood now that his gift, if it could be called that, was not merely about noticing patterns. It was about timing, about restraint, about choosing when to let understanding surface and when to keep it hidden. He learned that influence exercised too openly invited suppression, while influence exercised quietly could persist. This lesson did not come from instruction. It came from lived experience, from watching how systems responded to challenges they could not easily categorize. As scrutiny intensified, officials began to review records more closely. John's file, once unremarkable, was examined with renewed interest. Questions arose not about the crime that had brought him there, but about his behavior since. Reports noted his compliance, his lack of disciplinary infractions, his apparent awareness of routine. None of these qualities were inherently threatening, yet together they painted a picture that did not align with expectations. A child sentenced to prison was supposed to break, to become invisible through despair or disruptive through resistance. John had done neither. This contradiction unsettled those responsible for maintaining order. They debated its significance in private, careful to frame their concerns in administrative language rather than moral terms. To question the justice of John's sentence would have required confronting the fallibility of the system itself, a confrontation no one was eager to pursue. Instead, They focused on managing the present, on containing whatever influence he represented without acknowledging it explicitly. Containment took the form of proximity. John was assigned tasks that kept him under observation, moved closer to areas where oversight was constant. The rationale was practical, framed as efficiency rather than control. John understood the intent immediately. He accepted the assignments without protest, adjusting his behavior to the new conditions. He remained observant, but more guarded, aware that each glance, each word, might now be interpreted differently. This proximity altered his internal calculus. The margin for error narrowed. Speaking carried greater risk. Silence carried greater consequence. He navigated this tension carefully, relying on the same patience that had sustained him since his arrival. He did not rush to assert his understanding. He waited for moments where intervention felt necessary, rather than merely helpful. These moments were rare, but when they arrived, he chose them deliberately. One such moment occurred during a routine transfer that had been poorly coordinated. John noticed the misalignment immediately, the way schedules overlapped incorrectly, the way guards were positioned in ways that created blind spots. He hesitated, weighing the risk of speaking against the potential harm of silence. When he spoke, it was brief and precise, offered to a supervisor known for pragmatism rather than pride. The supervisor listened, adjusted the plan slightly, and the transfer proceeded without incident. Afterward, nothing was said. No acknowledgement was offered, yet the adjustment lingered as evidence that John's understanding had been quietly validated. This validation did not reassure him. It increased his awareness of how precarious his position had become. He understood now that his gift was no longer merely an anomaly. It was a variable the system was beginning to account for. The system's attempts to account for him, however, were constrained by its own logic. It could not openly rely on a child it had deemed criminal. It could not admit that awareness and innocence might coexist in ways that challenged its assumptions. Instead, it continued to adapt indirectly, reshaping routines, redistributing attention, tightening oversight. These adaptations created friction, revealing the effort required to maintain control when certainty wavered. John observed these changes with quiet clarity. He saw how authority reacted not to truth, but to threat real or perceived. He recognized that his presence had become a mirror reflecting the system, his own vulnerabilities. This realization did not embolden him, it humbled him. He understood that his survival depended on remaining unremarkable even as his influence persisted. Time continued to pass, and with it came moments of inevitability. The accumulation of observations, adjustments, and near misses built toward a point where coincidence could no longer plausibly explain the alignment between John's awareness and the prisoner's stability. The system, for all its resistance to introspection, could not indefinitely ignore patterns that contradicted its narratives. This recognition did not arrive as insight. It arrived as necessity. An incident loomed one larger, more complex than those that had come before. Tension spread through the facility in ways that even the most seasoned guards could not easily contain. John felt it days in advance, a convergence of signals that pointed toward escalation. He did not know exactly what would happen, only that something would. The awareness weighed heavily, pressing against the restraint he had cultivated so carefully. He faced a familiar choice, now amplified by scale. To speak risked exposure. To remain silent risked harm beyond himself. He understood that this moment would shape how he was seen, whether he intended it to or not. The gift no one could explain had reached a point where explanation might become unavoidable. As the tension intensified, John prepared quietly, aligning himself with the role he had always played: observer, listener, silent witness to forces larger than himself. He did not dramatize his awareness. He did not seek validation. He simply waited, attentive as ever, aware that the next expression of his understanding would carry consequences that could not be undone. The system, unaware of the depth of what was about to unfold, continued its routines with forced confidence. Guards spoke sharply. Orders were issued with increased urgency, and oversight tightened. Beneath this activity lay a brittle assurance that control would hold, that routine would absorb whatever pressure threatened to break it. John knew better, not because he wished for disruption, but because he could feel the patterns converging. The boy who had entered the prison as an erasure had become something the system could not fully ignore. Not a rebel, not a hero, but a presence whose awareness intersected with reality in ways that demanded attention. The gift, unnamed and unacknowledged, continued to shape events quietly, carrying the story toward a moment when silence would no longer be sufficient to contain it. The convergence, John sensed, did not announce itself with urgency or alarm. It revealed itself through accumulation, the way pressure builds invisibly until the structure holding it begins to creak. The days leading up to it felt heavier, not louder. Movements were sharper, routines more rigid, conversations clipped and purposeful. The prisoner's attempt to reinforce order was unmistakable, yet that very reinforcement signaled vulnerability. Systems do not tighten unless they sense the possibility of fracture. John felt that fracture long before it appeared on the surface. He felt it in the altered cadence of footsteps, in the way guards lingered longer at intersections, in the sudden insistence on protocol where flexibility had once been quietly allowed. These were not corrections born of confidence. They were reactions born of unease. John adjusted instinctively. He spoke even less, conserving his words with deliberate care. He understood that the closer a system came to a breaking point, the less tolerant it became of ambiguity. Ambiguity threatened control, and control, when threatened, responded harshly. He positioned himself where observation was possible without visibility, performing his tasks with the same unremarkable precision that had kept him safe for years. To anyone watching casually, he appeared unchanged. To those paying closer attention, there was a heightened stillness about him, as though he were bracing for something he could not yet name. The incident itself began as many did, with something small. A delay. A miscommunication. A decision made too quickly by someone already fatigued by long hours and mounting pressure. John noticed the shift immediately, the way several minor deviations aligned into a single trajectory. It was not one mistake that concerned him, but the way multiple small errors pointed in the same direction. Experience had taught him that such alignment rarely ended quietly. He felt the familiar tension of choice settle over him, heavier now because the stakes had grown. Silence had protected him before. This time, silence felt dangerous. He did not rush forward. He did not announce his concern publicly. He waited for a moment when intervention might be heard rather than dismissed. Timing mattered more than certainty. When that moment came, he spoke to a guard whose posture suggested uncertainty rather than authority, someone still capable of listening rather than reacting. John's words were brief, almost understated. He did not predict disaster. He named inconsistency. He pointed out where routine had diverged from itself. He framed his observation as concern rather than warning. The guard hesitated, irritation flickering across his face before giving way to something else, recognition. The guard did not respond verbally. He adjusted his position, glanced toward a colleague, and made a subtle change to the arrangement. That small change slowed the momentum just enough to draw attention. Others noticed. Questions were asked. Corrections followed. What might have escalated into chaos dissipated into controlled movement. The incident passed without spectacle, but it did not pass without consequence. This time, the alignment between John's observation and the outcome could not be dismissed quietly. Too many people had witnessed the near miss. Too many adjustments had been made in response to something he had named. The system could no longer pretend that coincidence explained everything. The air shifted perceptibly, charged now with a different kind of attention. John felt it immediately, the way eyes lingered longer, the way conversations paused when he entered a space, the way his presence seemed to alter the flow of routine even when he said nothing. Officials convened behind closed doors. John did not hear these conversations, but he did not need to. He understood the patterns well enough to anticipate their content. They would speak of risk, of unpredictability, of the need to understand variables. They would not speak of innocence or injustice. Those concepts complicated administration. They would frame John not as a child, but as a factor, something to be managed rather than acknowledged. This reframing did not surprise him. He had learned long ago that systems rarely asked why when they could ask how. The scrutiny that followed was more direct than before. John was questioned not aggressively, but persistently. The questions were framed as curiosity, as attempts to understand his behavior. He answered carefully, offering nothing that could suggest intention or claim authority. He spoke of listening, of noticing patterns, of acting when something felt out of place. He avoided language that might elevate his awareness into something mystical or threatening. He presented himself as observant but ordinary, careful not to appear exceptional. Exceptional invited control. Ordinary could be absorbed. The officials listened with measured expressions, their interest sharpened by discomfort. His explanations did not satisfy them, not because they were unconvincing, but because they did not align with expectation. There was no framework within their understanding that accounted for a child developing such awareness without guidance or training. They searched for motive, for influence, for some external source they could identify and regulate. Finding none unsettled them further. In response, they altered his environment. John was reassigned, moved between tasks more frequently, kept under closer observation. The rationale was efficiency, though its purpose was clearly containment. They sought to understand him by limiting variables, by placing him where his actions could be monitored more closely. John recognized the strategy immediately. He accepted the changes without protest, knowing that resistance would only confirm suspicion. He adapted as he always had, recalibrating his behavior to the new conditions. This recalibration was not easy. Increased visibility meant reduced margin for error. Every word carried weight now, every pause subject to interpretation. John felt the strain of this attention acutely, though he did not allow it to show. He returned to the discipline that had sustained him from the beginning, listening more than speaking, observing more than acting. He understood now that his gift, once a means of survival, had become something the system both relied upon and feared. That duality placed him in a precarious position. The other inmates sensed the shift as well. Some grew wary, distancing themselves to avoid association. Others watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution, aware that proximity to attention could be dangerous. A few, those who understood the cost of awareness, offered subtle gestures of acknowledgement, nothing overt, nothing that could be traced. John accepted these gestures without response. He did not seek alliance. Alliance would have complicated matters. His focus remained on navigating the tightening space around him. As weeks passed, the system's response grew more contradictory. On one hand, officials began to adjust routines based on observations John had previously made, though they never acknowledged the source. On the other, they intensified efforts to limit his influence, moving him frequently, ensuring he remained peripheral rather than central. This contradiction revealed the system's dilemma. It could not deny the utility of his awareness, yet it could not accept the implications of acknowledging it. John observed this contradiction with quiet clarity. He saw how authority struggled when forced to rely on something it could not openly validate. He understood that this struggle was not about him personally, but about what his presence represented, a challenge to the assumption that insight flowed downward from authority rather than upward from experience. This understanding did not embolden him. It made him more cautious. He recognized that the closer the system came to admitting its reliance on him, the more dangerous his position became. The incident that finally forced resolution was larger than any before. Tension had been building across the facility for weeks, fueled by external pressures and internal strain. John felt it in the alignment of signals. He had learned to trust the way voices sharpened, the way routines faltered, the way oversight intensified without producing calm. He knew that this time, adjustments alone would not be enough. The trajectory pointed toward something that could not be contained quietly. He faced the most difficult choice he had encountered yet. To speak would expose him fully, forcing the system to confront what it had been avoiding. To remain silent would allow harm to unfold unchecked. The weight of this choice settled heavily, not as fear, but as responsibility. He did not consider heroism. He considered consequence. He understood that whatever he did next would alter how he was seen, and once altered, that perception could not be undone. When he spoke, it was not dramatic. It was precise, directed, unavoidable. He named the convergence he had been tracking, the alignment of factors that pointed toward escalation. He did not embellish. He did not predict outcomes beyond what his observations supported. His words carried authority not because of how they were delivered, but because of how they aligned with what others were beginning to sense. This time, the response was immediate. Officials listened, not dismissively, but intently. Adjustments were made quickly, decisively. Orders shifted. Routines changed. The momentum toward crisis slowed, then dissipated. The facility stabilized not through force, but through prevention. The absence of spectacle was itself remarkable. What could have erupted into violence dissolved into controlled movement, the kind that left little visible trace. In the aftermath, silence settled heavily. No one spoke of John openly. No commendation was offered. No acknowledgement recorded. Yet the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. The system could no longer deny what had occurred. The alignment between his awareness and stability was undeniable now. The gift no one could explain had moved from anomaly to necessity. Officials convened again, this time with greater urgency. The language used was careful, stripped of moral implication. They spoke of patterns, of intuition, of the need for proactive oversight. They debated how to manage what had become apparent without undermining authority. The question was not whether John mattered. It was how to incorporate his presence without acknowledging its significance. John sensed these deliberations unfolding around him like shifting walls. He felt the pressure of being necessary yet unrecognized, relied upon yet constrained. This paradox weighed heavily, but he carried it with the same steadiness that had sustained him from the beginning. He did not demand recognition. Demand would have provoked backlash. Instead, he remained where he was, attentive and restrained, allowing the system to grapple with its own contradictions. The gift no one could explain had reached a turning point. It could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, nor could it be fully acknowledged without unsettling the foundations of authority. John stood at the center of this tension, not by choice but by consequence. He understood now that the injustice of his sentence was no longer the only truth the system sought to avoid. His continued presence exposed something deeper that awareness, once cultivated, could not be confined by walls or verdicts. As the facility returned to its routines, those routines carried a new undercurrent of caution. Decisions were made more carefully. Oversight increased in subtle ways. The system adapted, absorbing the shock without naming it. John watched this adaptation unfold, aware that his story was no longer solely his own. It had become entangled with the system, its attempt to preserve control while relying on something it could not fully claim. The boy who had entered the prison as a convenient erasure now occupied a space the system had not planned for. Not a rebel, not a savior, but a presence whose awareness had altered outcomes too often to ignore. The pressure that had built quietly for years had finally found expression, and in doing so it forced the system to change incrementally, reluctantly, but permanently. What came next would determine not only John's fate, but how the system chose to resolve the contradiction he represented. Silence was no longer sufficient. Coincidence was no longer plausible. The gift no one could explain had revealed itself through consequence, and consequence demanded response. The story had moved beyond observation. It had entered reckoning. The reckoning did not resolve itself quickly or cleanly, because systems built to preserve authority rarely admit disruption without resistance. And the days following the incident unfolded with a strange mixture of calm and tension that felt more unsettling than outright conflict. On the surface, routines resumed, schedules stabilized, and the machinery of the prison returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath that rhythm there was a new carefulness, a sense that every decision now carried an invisible second layer of consideration. John felt this immediately, not because anyone spoke to him differently, but because the air itself had changed. Where once oversight had been blunt and reactive, it was now precise and anticipatory, as though the institution had learned to listen without acknowledging what it had heard. Guards adjusted their movements more thoughtfully. Supervisors lingered at junctions they had previously ignored, and minor issues were addressed before they could escalate. None of this was attributed to John, yet all of it bore the unmistakable imprint of the awareness he had forced into the open. He understood that the system was attempting to absorb the disruption without naming it, to incorporate prevention while preserving the illusion of control, and this attempt placed him in an even more precarious position than before. Being unnoticed had once protected him. Being necessary but unacknowledged now made him vulnerable in new ways. Officials began to interact with him more frequently, though never directly, about what had occurred. Their questions circled around his routines, his habits, his perceptions, always framed as casual inquiry rather than interrogation, yet each carried an undercurrent of evaluation. John answered carefully, offering nothing that suggested intention or authority, framing his awareness as instinct shaped by environment rather than insight that challenged hierarchy. He sensed that they were searching for a way to explain him that did not implicate the system itself, a narrative that would allow them to categorize his presence without confronting the injustice that had placed him there. Finding none, they shifted strategy, focusing less on understanding him and more on managing his influence. This management took subtle forms: reassignment to areas where his presence could be monitored, increased structure around his tasks, and a quiet discouragement of interaction between him and others. The rationale remained administrative, but the intent was containment, and John recognized it instantly. He complied without comment, adjusting his behavior to minimize friction, aware that resistance would only reinforce suspicion. The other inmates felt the change too, though few could articulate it clearly. Some withdrew further, unwilling to be associated with attention they did not understand. Others watched John with a new kind of respect tinged with caution, sensing that something about him had altered the balance of the place. John did not seek their acknowledgement, nor did he reject it. He understood that visibility among inmates could be as dangerous as visibility among officials. He maintained his distance, preserving the careful neutrality that had kept him safe for so long. Yet neutrality no longer felt sufficient. The system's reliance on unspoken prevention created a tension that could not be sustained indefinitely. Each time a potential crisis was quietly averted, the contradiction deepened. The institution depended on awareness it refused to acknowledge, and that dependence eroded the certainty on which authority rested. John saw this erosion in small signs: the hesitation before orders were issued, the glances exchanged between supervisors, the way protocols were discussed rather than assumed. These signs confirmed what he had begun to understand. The system was adapting, but adaptation carried a cost, and that cost was confidence. As confidence thinned, the system became more cautious, and caution, while safer, also invited scrutiny. That scrutiny turned, inevitably, toward the foundations of John's presence there. His case resurfaced in administrative conversations, not as a moral question, but as a procedural one. Officials reviewed records, timelines, testimonies, looking not for innocence, but for irregularity, anything that could be framed as error rather than injustice. Error could be corrected without challenging the legitimacy of the system. Injustice could not. John sensed this review long before it became visible, feeling it in the renewed attention to his history, the way questions drifted toward his past rather than his prison. He responded with the same measured clarity he had always maintained, recounting events without embellishment, neither accusing nor defending, simply stating what he remembered. His calm unsettled those listening, because it did not align with the narratives they expected from someone wronged. They anticipated anger, bitterness, desperation. Instead, they encountered steadiness, an awareness shaped by endurance rather than resentment. This steadiness complicated their efforts because it resisted categorization as either compliant or rebellious. It suggested a third possibility the system was ill-equipped to handle, integrity maintained under constraint. As the review progressed, the institution faced a dilemma it could no longer avoid. John's continued presence posed risk, not because he threatened order, but because he exposed the system as dependence on unacknowledged insight. Releasing him without explanation would invite questions about why he had been held in the first place. Keeping him confined would perpetuate a contradiction that grew more visible with each quiet intervention. The solution they began to consider was gradual, framed administrative adjustment rather than admission of fault. Language softened. Terms like reassessment and reclassification replaced harsher labels. The narrative shifted subtly, positioning John's case as an anomaly rather than a consequence of systemic failure. John observed this shift with a clarity that surprised even him. He understood now that outcomes were often shaped not by truth, but by the stories institutions told themselves to preserve legitimacy. He did not cling to hope or despair as the review unfolded. He focused instead on maintaining the discipline that had carried him this far, listening, observing, responding only when necessary. He knew that whatever decision emerged would not erase what had already occurred. The system had been altered by his presence, and that alteration could not be undone by paperwork. Days stretched into weeks as deliberations continued, and the atmosphere within the facility remained taut, balanced between routine and anticipation. Guards enforced rules with renewed consistency, supervisors emphasized protocol, and the institution projected stability even as it adjusted internally. John felt the weight of this projection, understanding that stability often concealed fear rather than confidence. He carried that understanding quietly, aware that his role in what came next was uncertain. He might be moved, he might be released, he might remain, reshaped by new conditions. What mattered was not the specific outcome, but the fact that the system could no longer pretend he was insignificant. That recognition, however carefully managed, marked a turning point that extended beyond his individual fate. In moments of solitude, John reflected not on the injustice that had brought him there, but on the awareness that had sustained him within it. He understood with the realization that his gift, this ability to perceive patterns, to sense shifts before they erupted, had emerged not despite confinement, but through it. The prison had sharpened his listening, refined his attention, forced him to rely on perception rather than power. This realization did not romanticize his suffering. It contextualized it. He understood now that awareness could grow even in places designed to suppress it, and that such awareness carried responsibility whether or not one sought it. When the decision finally came, it arrived quietly, stripped of ceremony. There was no acknowledgement of innocence, no apology, no admission of error. Instead, there was a procedural resolution framed as correction rather than reckoning. John was informed that his status would change. that his future would be adjusted in ways that suggested release without naming it as such. The language was careful, chosen to minimize disruption, to allow the institution to move forward without confronting its past directly. John received this information with the same calm he had brought to every turning point. He did not celebrate. He did not protest. He understood that the significance of the moment lay not in what was said, but in what could no longer be denied. The system had been forced to act, and in acting, it had acknowledged, however obliquely, the limits of its certainty. As preparations were made, the atmosphere around him shifted again, this time carrying a different weight. Some guards avoided his gaze, others offered brief nods of recognition, still others maintained rigid formality. The inmates watched quietly, aware that something unusual was unfolding even if they did not know its full shape. John moved through these final days with deliberate steadiness, aware that transition itself carried risk. Freedom, like confinement, required orientation. He did not assume that leaving the prison would resolve the contradictions he had lived within. He understood that the world beyond operated on similar assumptions, though less overtly enforced. Yet he also understood that his awareness had been tempered by experience, that he carried with him a capacity to listen that could not be taken away. When he finally stepped beyond the walls, the absence of familiar sounds felt disorienting. The rhythms he had internalized, the clang of metal, the echo of corridors fell away, replaced by a broader, less predictable soundscape. John paused, listening as he always had, allowing the world to arrange itself within him before moving forward. He knew that the story did not end with his release. The system he left behind would continue, altered in small but significant ways by his presence. Routines would carry traces of prevention learned through reliance on unacknowledged awareness. Officials would remember the anomaly they could not fully explain, even if they never spoke of it aloud. The gift no one could explain had done more than secure his future. It had exposed the fragility of certainty, and the quiet power of listening in a world built to reward certainty over truth. John stepped into that world not as a symbol or a spectacle, but as someone who had learned through endurance how to navigate forces larger than himself without surrendering his integrity. The reckoning had not arrived as punishment or redemption. It had arrived as adjustment, as the system bending just enough to avoid breaking, leaving behind a subtle but enduring imprint that could not be erased. Stepping beyond the prison walls did not feel like arrival so much as displacement, as though John had been lifted from a world whose rules he had learned intimately and placed into another governed by assumptions he had never agreed to, but was expected to navigate all the same. Freedom, when it came, was quiet and procedural, stripped of ceremony and explanation, and this quietness unsettled him more than celebration ever could have. There were no crowds, no speeches, no acknowledgement of what had been taken or what had been endured. There was simply a door that opened, a boundary that no longer applied, and a space beyond it that felt vast precisely because it was undefined. John paused at the threshold longer than anyone expected, not out of fear but out of habit. He listened. He always listened first. The sounds beyond the walls were different, less contained, less predictable, layered with movement that did not echo back the way prison corridors did. He let those sounds settle into him, orienting himself before taking his first steps forward, aware that orientation was the difference between being free and being lost. The world outside did not greet him with clarity. It greeted him with noise, with questions that hovered unspoken, with glances that lingered just long enough to suggest curiosity or suspicion. People saw a young black boy emerging from confinement and filled the silence with their own narratives. Some assumed guilt that had gone unpunished. Others assumed damage that could never be undone. Few considered the possibility that awareness had grown rather than diminished within those walls. John sensed these assumptions immediately, reading them in posture and tone the same way he had learned to read guards and inmates. The skills that had sustained him inside did not vanish with release. They recalibrated. Adjusting to a broader, more chaotic environment, he was placed under supervision that carried a different name but felt familiar in practice. There were expectations, schedules, boundaries framed as support rather than control, yet the structure remained unmistakable. The system had not let him go entirely. It had merely changed the shape of its oversight. John recognized this without resentment. He understood that institutions rarely relinquished control cleanly. They rebranded it, softened its language, and called it care. He accepted the structure cautiously, aware that resistance would only invite closer scrutiny, while compliance would buy him space to observe. Those responsible for monitoring him spoke often of opportunity, of second chances, of the importance of gratitude. John listened respectfully, hearing beneath their words the need for reassurance that the system, having adjusted his fate, still deserved legitimacy. He did not challenge this need. He had learned that legitimacy, like authority, depended on belief, and belief was not something he could dismantle through argument. Instead, he focused on adapting, on learning the patterns of this new environment the same way he had learned the patterns of the prison. Schools, workplaces, public spaces each carried its own rhythms, its own unspoken rules, and John absorbed them quickly. What surprised those around him was not his compliance but his steadiness. They expected fragility, outbursts, or withdrawal. Instead, they encountered attentiveness. John listened more than he spoke, asked questions that revealed careful thought rather than confusion, and moved through spaces with a deliberateness that suggested intention. Teachers and supervisors noted this quietly, unsure how to interpret it. Some praised his maturity. Others found it unsettling, sensing a depth they could not easily categorize. Once again, John occupied a space the system did not quite know how to manage, neither broken nor defiant, but quietly aware. The gift no one could explain did not announce itself immediately in this new context. John did not volunteer his observations. He had learned the cost of visibility and chose discretion. Yet awareness, once sharpened, does not lie dormant. He noticed shifts in classrooms before arguments erupted, sensed tension in group settings before it became disruptive, anticipated changes in routine before they were announced. At first, these perceptions remained internal, tools for his own navigation rather than interventions meant to shape outcomes. He was cautious, understanding that the tolerance for a boy anticipating authority, as movements might be even thinner outside prison walls than within them. Over time, however, moments arose when silence felt heavier than speech. A misunderstanding escalating toward conflict. A decision being made hastily that would harm someone already vulnerable. John weighed these moments carefully, the same way he had learned to do inside. When he spoke, he did so gently, framing his words as concern rather than prediction, as observation rather than instruction. The responses varied. Some listened, adjusting course without comment. Others dismissed him, uncomfortable with insight that did not come from sanctioned authority. A few looked at him with narrowed eyes, sensing something they could not name. Each response taught John more about the world he now inhabited. He learned that outside the prison, authority was more diffuse but no less defensive. It hid behind professionalism, behind procedure, behind language that framed control as consensus. The skills he had developed listening, timing, restraint proved just as necessary here, perhaps more so. He realized that freedom did not mean the absence of constraint. It meant navigating constraints that were less explicit, but equally powerful. The system that had released him did not forget him. Periodic reviews, check-ins, and reports continued. Each one a reminder that his story remained unfinished in institutional memory. Officials monitored his adjustment closely, not out of care alone, but out of self-protection. His success would validate their decision, his failure would justify their caution. John understood this dynamic instinctively. He did not perform gratitude or resentment. He performed steadiness, offering them nothing that could be easily interpreted as confirmation of their fears. As months passed, the memory of the prison began to recede in texture but not in lesson. The sounds, the routines, the constant vigilance faded, yet the orientation they had given him remained. He understood now that his gift was not confined to a particular place. It was a way of engaging with the world that could not be undone. This realization brought both confidence and burden. Awareness made him capable, but it also made him responsible in ways others were not. He felt the pull to intervene when he sensed harm approaching, even when intervention carried risk. He felt the weight of knowing without being able to explain how he knew. Those closest to him, mentors assigned, teachers who paid attention, peers who noticed his steadiness began to ask questions. Not accusations, but curiosity edged with caution. How did he notice things so early? Why did he seem to anticipate outcomes others missed? John answered honestly but simply. He spoke of listening, of paying attention, of noticing patterns. Some accepted these explanations. Others searched for something more, some hidden ability that would make his awareness easier to categorize and therefore easier to dismiss as anomaly rather than implication. The implications, however, lingered. John's presence challenged assumptions about what confinement did to people, about who emerged broken and who emerged sharpened. He did not fit the narrative of rehabilitation or redemption neatly. He had not been transformed by punishment. He had been refined by observation. This distinction unsettled those invested in the idea that systems corrected through suffering. His story suggested something more uncomfortable, that awareness could grow in spite of injustice, and that such awareness exposed the limits of authority rather than affirming it. The tension this created was subtle but persistent. Opportunities were offered cautiously, always with conditions. Praise was measured, never unqualified. Trust was extended incrementally, tested repeatedly. John accepted these terms without complaint, understanding that trust, once broken by unjust accusation, was not easily restored. He focused on consistency, allowing time to do what argument could not. Time, he knew, had a way of revealing patterns even to those reluctant to see them. In moments of solitude, John reflected on the path that had brought him here, not with bitterness but with clarity shaped by distance. He understood now that the injustice of his sentence had not been an isolated failure, but a symptom of a system more invested in resolution than truth. He did not expect that system to change completely because of him. Change, he had learned, was rarely total or immediate. It arrived in adjustments, in hesitations, in moments where certainty gave way to caution. He saw these adjustments in the way officials spoke more carefully around him, in the way decisions affecting him were revisited more than once, in the way his file, once static, remained active, annotated, reconsidered. The system had not apologized, but it had altered its behavior, and behavior, John understood, was often more telling than words. The gift no one could explain had followed him beyond the walls, continuing to shape outcomes quietly, persistently, without spectacle. As he moved further into this new life, John understood that his story was still unfolding. Freedom was not an endpoint. It was a different terrain requiring the same discipline that had sustained him before. He did not know where his path would lead, only that the awareness he carried would accompany him wherever he went. He accepted this with a calm that surprised even him, recognizing that what had once been a means of survival had become a way of being. The system that had tried to erase him now watched him carefully, uncertain what to make of a boy who had endured injustice without internalizing it, who had emerged not hardened but attentive. That uncertainty lingered, shaping interactions in ways subtle enough to deny yet too persistent to ignore. John walked forward within that uncertainty, not seeking to resolve it but prepared to live within it, listening as he always had, aware that the quietest stories often leave the deepest marks. What lay ahead would test his awareness in new ways, forcing him to decide not only when to speak, but how to carry the weight of understanding in a world that still struggled to hear it. The prison had taught him how to survive attention. Freedom would teach him how to live with it. As John moved deeper into life beyond confinement, he discovered that the most difficult adjustment was not learning new routines, but unlearning the constant readiness that had once kept him safe. Inside the prison, vigilance had been essential. Outside, it lingered as a reflex that no longer had a single obvious target. He listened to everything: the cadence of conversations, the pauses between words, the way people smiled without warmth or offered reassurance without commitment. And this listening revealed a world that was less overtly rigid than the one he had left, yet no less governed by power and expectation. Freedom did not remove structure, it dispersed it, embedding it in customs, norms, and assumptions that were harder to name, and therefore harder to navigate. John understood this instinctively. He felt it in classrooms where questions were welcomed in theory but discouraged in practice, in workplaces where initiative was praised until it disrupted hierarchy, in social spaces where belonging depended on performing ease rather than acknowledging difference. The discipline he had cultivated did not abandon him. It adapted, shaping how he entered rooms, how he chose words, how he weighed silence against speech. Those around him noticed the steadiness he carried, but they misread it as maturity rather than vigilance, composure rather than calculation. John did not correct them. Explanation would have required disclosure, and disclosure would have shifted the balance he had learned to maintain. Instead, he let time do what it often did best: reveal consistency to those willing to notice. Over months and then years, people began to trust him not because he was charismatic or assertive, but because his presence seemed to lower the temperature of tense situations. He noticed disagreements before they hardened into conflict, sensed confusion before it became frustration, and named concerns gently enough that they could be addressed without defensiveness. Each time this happened, the response followed a familiar pattern: quiet adjustment, unspoken relief, and a reluctance to attribute the outcome to him directly. The pattern echoed the one he had known inside, and the recognition unsettled him. He realized that the world outside had learned many of the same habits, as the institution he had left absorbing insight without acknowledging its source, preserving authority by keeping influence diffuse and unnamed. This realization did not embitter him. It clarified his understanding of how power traveled and why it resisted attribution. As his life expanded, opportunities arose that tested not only his awareness but his restraint. Invitations to speak more openly, to lead, to step into roles where his influence would be visible and therefore accountable. Each invitation carried promise and risk. Visibility could amplify his impact, but it could also distort it, turning careful observation into expectation and turning expectation into burden. John approached these choices with patience, remembering that haste often served others' agendas rather than his own. He accepted some opportunities cautiously, declining others without explanation, shaping a path that balanced presence with protection. Those who mentored him sensed his deliberation and interpreted it as humility. They did not see the calculations beneath it, the memory of how quickly attention could turn punitive when it felt threatened. The system that had once confined him remained present at the edges of his life, not through direct control but through memory and record. Occasional check-ins, references to his past framed as concern, subtle reminders that his story had not been fully erased from institutional consciousness. These reminders no longer frightened him, but they sharpened his awareness of how permanence worked. A record, once created, rarely vanished completely. It waited dormant, ready to be invoked when convenient. John responded to this knowledge by maintaining consistency, offering nothing that could be misinterpreted as volatility or defiance. He understood now that stability was not merely personal, it was strategic. In this steadiness, he found a quiet confidence that did not depend on validation. He began to recognize the contours of his gift more clearly, not as prophecy or intuition, but as attunement. He was attuned to the spaces between words, to the signals people sent without intending to the patterns that emerged when fear met authority. This attunement did not make him infallible. He misread situations at times, underestimated resistance, overestimated openness. When that happened, he adjusted, learning from the misalignment rather than retreating from engagement altogether. This capacity to recalibrate became as important as the awareness itself. It allowed him to remain flexible without losing coherence, to change course without abandoning principle. As his confidence grew, so did the complexity of the situations he encountered. He found himself drawn into contexts where stakes were higher, where decisions affected not only individuals but communities. In these spaces, the temptation to speak decisively, to claim authority rather than influence, pressed more strongly. John felt that temptation and resisted it, not out of fear, but out of respect for the limits of what he could know. He remembered how easily certainty could become a weapon, how quickly good intentions could be repurposed to justify harm. Instead of asserting answers, he asked questions that opened space for others to articulate concerns they had been carrying silently. This approach frustrated some, who wanted clear direction and decisive leadership. Others found it disarming, even transformative, because it shifted responsibility from hierarchy to collective understanding. The results were uneven but instructive. Where people were willing to listen to one another, progress followed. Where authority demanded obedience without engagement, tension persisted. John learned to recognize which environments could sustain his approach and which would consume it. This discernment guided his choices more than ambition ever could. The echoes of the prison continued to surface in unexpected ways, sounds that triggered memory, situations that recalled old vigilance, but they no longer dominated his internal landscape. Instead, they served as reference points, reminders of what he had survived and what he had learned. He did not romanticize that survival. He acknowledged the cost, the years shaped by confinement, the innocence lost not through guilt but through exposure. Yet he also recognized the resilience that had emerged alongside the loss, the clarity forged in conditions that demanded attention as a means of survival. This recognition allowed him to integrate his past without being defined by it. People who learned fragments of his story often reacted with a mixture of pity and admiration, neither of which felt accurate to him. Pity flattened his experience into victimhood. Admiration elevated it into exception. He corrected neither response directly. He understood that narratives served the needs of those telling them, and that his task was not to manage others' interpretations, but to live with integrity within his own. When he did speak about his past, he spoke of listening, of pattern, of the way systems revealed themselves through repetition. He avoided sensational detail, focusing instead on what the experience had taught him about attention and consequence. Some listeners heard wisdom in this. Others heard discomfort. Both reactions confirmed his understanding that truth, when offered without ornament, often unsettled more than it reassured. As time passed, John began to see the longer arc of his influence, not in dramatic changes, but in altered behaviors that persisted after he moved on. Meetings that adopted slower pacing, decisions that incorporated pause, groups that learned to name tension before it escalated. These changes were rarely attributed to him. They became part of the environment, absorbed and normalized. This absorption mirrored the pattern he had known inside, and though it carried a familiar sting of invisibility, it also brought a quiet satisfaction. Influence that endured without credit was safer, more resilient, less likely to provoke backlash. John accepted this trade-off without resentment. He had learned that survival and impact often required relinquishing recognition. The world continued to test him, presenting moments when silence felt complicit and speech felt risky. Each time, he returned to the same internal process, listening first, weighing consequence, choosing the least harmful path available. This process did not guarantee success, but it preserved coherence. It allowed him to act without losing himself, to intervene without becoming what he resisted. In this way, the gift no one could explain matured into something steadier, less reactive, more grounded. It was no longer merely a response to threat. It was a way of being that sought alignment rather than control. As John looked toward the future, he did not imagine a moment when his awareness would no longer be needed. He understood now that vigilance was not a phase but a practice, one that could be refined rather than endured. He did not seek a world without tension. He sought the capacity to meet tension without violence, without erasure. This aspiration did not make him naive. It made him careful. The system that had once confined him had not disappeared. It had changed form, dispersed into institutions and expectations that shaped daily life. John navigated these structures with a quiet competence that surprised those who underestimated him. He did not announce his understanding, he demonstrated it through consistency. And as he did, the memory of the boy who had entered prison as an erasure receded, replaced by the presence of a man who had learned how to listen his way through the world. The story was not finished. It had simply entered a phase where consequence unfolded slowly, through choices that accumulated rather than exploded. What remained was the final test not of awareness but of endurance. Could he continue to carry the weight of understanding without becoming isolated by it? Could he remain open without becoming exposed? These questions did not demand immediate answers. They invited patience, the same patience that had sustained him from the beginning. And so John moved forward, attentive and deliberate, prepared to meet whatever came next with the only tools that had ever truly been his: listening, restraint, and the quiet courage to notice what others preferred to ignore. As the years unfolded and John's life continued to stretch outward from the narrow corridors that had once defined it, the final test he faced was not whether he could survive injustice or navigate attention, but whether he could live fully without allowing vigilance to harden into isolation. Awareness, when carried too long without rest, could become a wall as confining as any cell, and John sensed this danger quietly, the way he sensed most things through subtle shifts rather than dramatic signs. He noticed it in moments when he chose distance over connection without necessity, when he withheld warmth out of habit rather than discernment, when listening became a shield instead of a bridge. These realizations did not arrive with alarm, they arrived with reflection, inviting him to examine not just how he moved through the world, but why. He understood now that the gift no one could explain had matured into something powerful but incomplete on its own. Awareness could prevent harm, anticipate conflict, and expose fragile authority. But it could not, by itself, create belonging. Belonging required risk, the kind of risk that could not be calculated entirely, that demanded trust without guarantee. This understanding challenged him more deeply than any institutional scrutiny ever had, because it asked him to loosen the very discipline that had kept him alive. John did not abandon that discipline, he refined it, learning to distinguish between caution born of wisdom and caution born of fear. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. Fear closed doors quietly, disguising itself as prudence. Wisdom opened doors selectively, inviting connection without surrendering clarity. Learning this difference took time, patience, and a willingness to be misread. John practiced it gradually, allowing himself moments of openness that did not compromise his integrity, moments where he spoke not because harm loomed, but because understanding could deepen. In these moments, he shared fragments of his story, not the sensational details others expected, but the interior truths that shaped his choices. He spoke of listening, of how silence had once been necessary, of how patterns revealed themselves when one paid attention without rushing to judgment. Some listeners leaned in, recognizing something of themselves in his words. Others grew uncomfortable, sensing that his reflections unsettled assumptions they relied upon. John accepted both reactions without adjustment. He had learned that resonance could not be forced, and discomfort was not always something to be avoided. As his relationships deepened, he discovered that his awareness did not distance him from others as much as he had feared. When shared carefully, it became a point of connection rather than separation. People began to seek him out not for answers, but for presence, for the way he listened without interruption, for the calm he brought to conversations that might otherwise fracture. This shift surprised him, not because he doubted his capacity, but because it revealed a dimension of his gift he had not fully explored. Awareness, he realized, was not only preventive, it was generative. It could create spaces where truth emerged without coercion, where conflict softened into dialogue, where people felt seen without being hintlessly exposed. These spaces were fragile, easily disrupted by urgency or ego, yet when they held, they altered outcomes in ways no directive ever could. John nurtured these spaces quietly, without naming his role in them, allowing others to take ownership of what unfolded. This approach mirrored the pattern of influence he had known all his life, unnamed, absorbed, enduring, and this time, it did not sting. He had come to understand that recognition, while validating, was not the measure of impact. Impact lived in what persisted after one left the room. The world beyond institutions proved no less complex than the one within them. Power shifted forms, authority changed costumes, but the underlying dynamics remained familiar. John navigated these dynamics with increasing ease, not because they no longer threatened him, but because he no longer needed to orient himself entirely around them. He had built an internal compass grounded in observation, restraint, and now, selective openness. This compass guided him through moments of uncertainty, allowing him to respond rather than react, to choose engagement without surrendering self. He did not seek to dismantle systems wholesale. He understood their resilience too well for that. Instead, he focused on what could be influenced: conversations, decisions, moments where pause could prevent harm. This focus did not make him complacent. It made him precise. He learned that precision, when sustained over time, could outlast spectacle. As he looked back on the path he had traveled, John recognized that the injustice that had once defined his story had become only one chapter among many. It had shaped him, yes, but it had not consumed him. He did not frame his life as redemption or triumph. Those narratives felt too neat, too eager to resolve discomfort. Instead, he understood his journey as adaptation, a continuous process of learning how to carry awareness without letting it calcify into armor. The boy who had once listened because silence was safer had grown into a man who listened because understanding mattered. That shift, subtle as it was, marked the true transformation of his gift. It no longer existed solely to protect him from harm. It existed to help him navigate complexity with integrity. The system that had once erased him faded into background memory, its influence lingering but no longer central. Records remained, histories persisted, but they no longer dictated his sense of self. He had reclaimed authorship of his narrative not by rewriting the past, but by living forward with coherence. This coherence did not erase pain or prevent future challenges. It provided context, allowing him to meet those challenges without losing perspective. He understood now that injustice often sought to define people by what it took from them. Refusing that definition was an act of quiet resistance, one sustained not through anger, but through attentiveness to what remained. What remained for John was the capacity to notice shifts before they hardened, to notice fear beneath certainty, to notice humanity where systems preferred abstraction. This capacity did not make life easier, but it made it meaningful in ways that could not be revoked. As time continued its work, John Eyre's story intersected with others, influencing paths he might never fully trace. A conversation that changed how someone approached authority. A pause that prevented harm. A question that invited reflection rather than compliance. These intersections accumulated, forming a legacy not marked by recognition, but by altered trajectories. John did not count these outcomes or claim them as achievements. He allowed them to exist, trusting that influence, once released, did not require supervision. The gift no one could explain had become something simpler and more enduring, a way of being attentive in a world that often rewarded haste, a commitment to clarity in environments that thrived on ambiguity, a willingness to listen where others rushed to conclude. This way of being did not make him exceptional, it made him grounded. Grounded enough to engage without fear, grounded enough to step back when necessary, grounded enough to remain himself even as context shifted. In the end, there was no final verdict that redeemed or condemned the system that had shaped his early life. Systems rarely receive such closure. What endured instead was the evidence of adaptation, the quiet proof that awareness could survive injustice and emerge not hardened, but refined. John carried that proof forward, not as testimony against the past, but as guidance for the present. His life did not resolve into a moral lesson neatly packaged for comfort. It unfolded as a reminder that listening, when practiced with patience and courage, could alter the course of things in ways no one could fully predict or control. And if this story stayed with you, if it challenged how you think about innocence, about power, about the quiet ways people endure and influence the world, then subscribe to the Black Timeline. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories history tried to silence. And leave a comment sharing how deeply John's journey moved you. Because remembering these stories is not about dwelling on the past. It is about recognizing the quiet forces that shape the present and understanding that sometimes the most powerful gift is not the one that dazzles, but the one that listens, persists, and refuses to disappear.